with permission of Dean of School of International Studies, Professor Srikant Kondapalli, of holding yet another lecture in the Distinguished Lecture Series. Honorable Ambassador of Poland to India, and an excellent speaker among us, Dr. Pawel Ukielski from Poland. And what can be more timely than the speakers present from Poland to talk about Russia-Ukraine conflict and some historical linkages of the event and the repercussions for not just the region alone, but the entire globe. And to apprise you about the Distinguished Lecture Series, I would like to tell you that Distinguished Lecture Series is an ongoing event of School of International Studies where we invite and have honor of inviting distinguished lectures on areas and events related to international relations, international studies, which are pertinent, which are significant, which are sometimes eternal as well, and cut across the time and space dimensions. So to begin the proceedings of the lecture series, I would like to invite Professor Srikant Kondapalli, who is Dean of School of International Studies and an eminent scholar in the field of Chinese studies. And sir, over to you. Srikant, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Sharma. A very good morning to you all. We are fortunate enough today to have Ambassador Adam Ukielski amongst us. We also have the distinguished speaker, Professor Pawel Ukielski. Welcome to both of you from the Polish Embassy, the ambassador, as well as the scholar from the Polish Academy of Sciences. And we are excited to get to know about the topic, which is very important, very significant in the background of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February. And since the war is still dragging on, no better person than Professor Ukielski to speak to us on the historical background of the situation and the regional dynamics of Poland, Europe, Russia, Ukraine, and other major events that are part of this situation. So may I request His Excellency Adam Ukielski, the ambassador of the Polish Embassy, to speak for a few minutes, introducing the speaker. And let me tell the audience that the ambassador himself is a scholar of repute, and we are excited to listen to him. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Professor. It is my great pleasure to open this lecture of Dr. Pawel Ukielski. Thank you very much, Professor Srikant Kondapalli and Dr. Sheetal Sharma for organizing this lecture at the very prestigious School of International Studies of the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi. Me myself, I'm cooperating with SIS for a long time, and also Poland is cooperating with SIS. There is a MOU between the University of Warsaw and the JNU, and there are possibilities of exchange of students, of scholars, and I would like to encourage you to use these opportunities to visit Poland, and also we are encouraging Polish students and PhD candidates to visit JNU to get more information about India, to get the knowledge what India is and why India is important, and what we can do together bilaterally and on international scale. So it is my honor and pleasure to present Dr. Pawel Ukielski, the renowned scholar of political science, and his specialization in Central Eastern Europe, and also the politics of memory, because he is also the deputy director of the advise you to visit once you are in Warsaw. This is a very interesting place, and very modern museum. Shows you the history of the Warsaw Rising of 1944. The topic of the current meeting and discussion is the hot topic of the hot global topic, because the Russian aggression against Ukraine affected all the countries in the world in one or another way. Poland being the country that borders with both of these countries and shares a common history with Ukraine, and also to some extent with Russia. We think that we can give the insight that might be interesting for you. And we invited Dr. Pawel Ukielski, as a renowned scholar with a broad experience in these topics, and also in the let's call it like this, the Central European, Central Eastern European spirit, because besides of this, what I've told about him, he also is involved and has been involved in the last 20 years in various formats of regional cooperation in Central Eastern Europe with all the countries. Let me pass the floor to Dr. Pawel Ukielski. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the invitation, for this introduction. I would like to present you well, the long story of common living of Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians in the historical perspective. Now let me share the screen. Yes, okay. So we can start, but I will not start with a very ancient history. I will go to that a little bit further, but I will start with famous Huntington's article. He wrote the article in 1993, shortly after the Cold War ended. And what he claimed that the most important conflicts of the future will occur along the cultural fault lines separating the civilizations one from another. And he defined 8 civilizations. Those were Western, Confucian, Japanese, Islamic, Hindu, Slavic Orthodox, Latin American, and African. So it was very famous article. He was, I would say, a counterbalance to the Fukuyama's The End of History. And it was broadly disputed, and many scholars did agree with his vision of international relations, or what would be important in international relations or global relations in the nearest future. But going further, or going more in depth to the Huntingtonian's article, we find a quotation. If civilization is what counts, however, the likelihood of violence between Ukrainians and Russians should be low. They are two Slavic, primarily Orthodox peoples who have had close relationships with each other for centuries. So this is a direct quotation from Huntington's article. We can see here on this slide the fault line or borderline between the Western civilization and what he called Slavic Orthodox civilization. The question is it a proof that Huntington was totally mistaken? And let's put a full stop here, and we'll return to that question in the very end. Now let's go to the history of the region. The beginning of our common history reaches more or less 10th century of 10th century, when the Polish state was established with the baptism of Poland in the year 966, and the baptism of Kievan Rus in the year 988. Nobody or Moscow did not exist at that time. Kiev was the main city of Kievan Rus or this East European state. Then Kievan Rus emerged before the Great Schism in Christianity. So it was not divided to Orthodox and Roman Catholic that time. The Great Schism came 70 years later, in the year 1054, and it meant fragmentation of Kievan Rus to smaller duchy, and also later on Poland was fragmented. It was in 12th century. At that time, Ruthenians or Slavic people from Rus, Kievan Rus, moved northeastern in the northeastern direction and established new principalities in which they had duches who finally in 12th century invaded Kiev. And for the first time in the year 1169, after invasion, they did not establish their own prince on the Kievan throne, but just seized Kiev and returned. So the future Muscovy did not want to have Kievan principality, but just to capture it. Then a huge Mongol invasion came in the mid 13th century, and it established, I would say, it subordinated mostly this northeastern part of Ruthenia or Russia, but also they seized Kiev. And from that moment on, soon we can see that those two parts of Slavic people from Rus established two different countries. On the one hand, we have Muscovite or Moscow. On the other, the Kievan, although it was fragmented, it moved their main point to Halych Volodymyr Duchy. So it is very important to understand that between 12th and 14th century, this division was very, very significant. So Rus, this part that today is Ukraine and Belarus, or as we call it sometimes Ruthenia, is definitely not the same as Russia. And what is very much important, let me return here, after the fall of Halych Volodymyr Duchy, or those remains of Kievan Rus, it became a part of Grand Duchy of Lithuania. So on the one hand, we had Moscow. On the other hand, Grand Duchy of Lithuania, that gathered more or less all the territories of former Kievan Rus, or what we see today as Belarus and Ukraine. And this border for a long time was very, very important. Let me now move to the next step of division of relations, development of relations, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Grand Duchy of Lithuania became a part of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In the end of 14th century, there was a first union, which was, I would say, sealed in a Battle of Grunwald against German order, and then it was finally sealed with the Lublin Union in the second half of 16th century. It created quite a big regional Central European power, and as you can see, from the end of 14th century until the mid 17th century, Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth in the east had a very long border with Moscow, and Ukrainian, Belarusian territories were a part of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. So we can see 300 years of strict border between Russia and Ukraine, if we use today's terms. One of the important moments in this history is also that Polish-Lithuanian forces captured Moscow in the year 1610, and they were probably the only ones that managed to capture Moscow and keep their garrison there for 2 years. Then the middle of 17th century came with a huge Polish or Polish-Lithuanian defeats that broke the power of Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Khmelnytsky uprising, Cossack uprising in today's Ukraine, led to the Treaty of Pereyaslav. The Treaty of Pereyaslav was signed by Cossacks, Ukrainian Cossacks on the one hand, and Russian Tsar on the other. And Cossacks subordinated themselves to Russia. It meant that this part of Polish-Lithuanian territory decided to join Russia. It caused, of course, Polish-Russian War, which was lost by Poland and ended with a treaty in 1667. It was, of course, not only Polish-Russian War, there was a very brutal Swedish invasion called in Poland Swedish deluge. And both those events totally devastated Poland or Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. You can see on the map the losses of territories, territorial losses of Poland due to the events of middle 17th century. And what is very important, in my opinion, this is the moment when Russia became an empire. Of course, Russia was spreading at that time also to the east, to Siberia, but Russia captured crucial territories in Eastern Europe and thus became an empire. On the other hand, Poland seized the status of regional power, in fact. It led to the partitions of Poland. Polish weakness in 17th and especially in 18th century led to the subordination to its neighbors. And in the second half of 18th century, Poland was partitioned by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. There were three steps in that process, and in the end, Poland was totally erased from the map of Europe. We can see on the map that even the weaker Poland, after the defeat in the war with Russia, still had quite a big part of today's Ukraine. You can see that Kiev was very near to the border, although it was already on the Russian side. The attempt to reform the state, to make it stronger, failed. In 1791, for example, Poland applied the first European constitution, but it was too late to save the country. For next 123 years, Poland was erased from the map of Europe. And if we discuss the question of Russians being an empire, you can see on the map clearly that it was really an empire reaching the Central European territories, especially in the Kingdom of Poland. It was 19th century for the whole Central European region was a very tough moment. Poland was the last state from our region that was deprived of independence. First states deprived of independence were Balkan states after Ottoman invasion in 14th century. Then Ottoman Empire broke Hungarian power in the Battle of Mohacs in 16th century. Bohemia lost its independence after Battle of White Mountain in 17th century, and in the end of 18th century, Poland was the last Central European kingdom that lost its independence. For the whole 19th century, Poles were trying to regain its independence. And what is very important, Polish identity, even though it was not only under occupation, but it was divided among three powers, three totally different: Russian Orthodox, Prussian Evangelical, and Austrian Roman Catholic. Poles kept their identity, and especially in Russia, Russian Empire tried to Russify Poles, but many Russian geopolitical intellectuals believed that it was impossible, and that taking such a big part of Poland into Russian Empire was a mistake, because Poles not only do not Russify, but they spread their ideas among Russians, and that could be dangerous. So part of Russian geopolitical elite was aware that Polish identity was very, very strong at that time. In the end, Poland regained independence in the year 1918, after the First World War. Polish troops were fighting on both sides because Poland as a state did not exist. Some Polish troops were part of Austrian army, some of German army, some of Russian army. And it was quite lucky situation for Poles that in fact in our region all three powers lost, because of course On the one hand, Russian and Austrian forces were on one side. On the other, German and Austrian forces were on the one side, Russian were on the other. But the revolution, Bolshevik revolution, made Russia retreat from the war, accept Minsk Treaty with Central Powers, so accepted German and Austrian demands, and after that, Germany and Austria lost the war. So it was a great opportunity for not only for Poland, but also for the whole Central Europe. Not only Poland regained independence. This process of forming the whole region started with the weakening of Ottoman Empire, with independence for Greece, for Bulgaria, for Romania, for Serbia in 19th century. But then it was completed after the First World War with the independence of Poland or Czechoslovakia or the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. So the new region in Europe, in fact, emerged as a result of the First World War. What it meant for Poland. Of course, in Poland, the remembrance of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was very, very strong. And the idea to create federal state with the Eastern European nations, with Ukrainians, with Belarusians, was quite strong. However, Bolsheviks, after winning the civil war in Russia, were not eager to admit territories to Poland, or even were interested in organizing the world revolution. And the first step for the world revolution was to invade Poland. Polish situation was, after the First World War, was on the one hand very good because Poland regained independence. On the other, it was quite problematic because of the need to fight for its borders from all sides. You can see here just the number of wars led by Poland in the first 4 years of independence, of which, of course, Polish Bolshevik War was the most important. And the role of Ukraine was very, very significant there. Ukraine wanted to be also independent. Poland signed a treaty with their leader, Ataman Petlura. Poland reached Kiev in May 1920. There was common parade of Polish and Ukrainian troops, but then the counterattack of Soviet Red Army came. Poland had to retreat from Ukrainian territory. Bolshevik forces came very close to the capital city of Poland. Some historians, British historians, believe that it was one of 20 most important battles in the world's history. The Battle of Warsaw in 1920, because it stopped Soviet offensive towards the west. Soviets wanted to reach German border to help German communists to organize their own revolution and spread the revolution all over the world. The Battle of Warsaw was won by Polish forces. Polish forces defeated Soviets very badly, and then came to counterattack with another important battle on Niemen River, which led to signing of Riga Treaty. Poland signed Riga Treaty with Soviet Russia. I underline it was still Soviet Russia because Soviet Union was established several months later. And the borderline was finally between Poland and Bolsheviks were finally established, thus creating finally what I call, because most historians call it Versailles Order, because of Treaty of Versailles signed in 1919, ending the First World War. I would say that a final solution of relations of Europe, in fact, of course, it was Polish-Soviet relations, but I would move it on European level. It was, in fact, establishing border between Europe and the Soviet Union. So I call this order Versailles Riga order, and creating a final map of Poland in the interwar period. You can see, if you remember today's map of Poland, you will see it soon. It is quite different, territorially, quite different state than today. So after the Polish-Bolshevik War, Poland had borders, as you can see on the map. On the other hand, you can see Soviet Union with a very small Belarus, because most of Belarusian territories, today's Belarusian territories, belonged to Poland, and also Ukraine, smaller than today. Soon the Soviet Union was established. There was ongoing debate within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. On the one hand, Stalin, who was convincing his comrades that there should be only Soviet Russia, incorporating other territories to Soviet Russia, even giving them quite a big autonomy. On the other hand, Lenin, who was rather in favor of creating formally federal state, with granting status of republics, independent republic in the federal states, to republics like Ukraine, Belarus, and other republics in Caucasus or Asia. One of the most important events in Ukrainian history is a great famine in the beginning of 30s. It was artificially organized famine which costed life of between 3.5 and 7 million of Ukrainian citizens, or citizens of the Soviet Union in Ukraine. It is broadly agreed among historians that it was artificially organized famine. In Ukrainian literature, it is called Holodomor, which literally means death by hunger or death by starvation. It affected especially the eastern parts of Ukraine, where the depopulation exceeded 25%. So you can imagine the scale of the tragedy. In 2006, Ukrainian authorities recognized Holodomor as a genocide committed by the leadership of the Soviet Union, and it is recognized as such, as a genocide by, I think, 16 countries right now, all over the world. And of course, this affected also Ukrainian-Russian relations for years. Then the Second World War came, preceded by Ribbentrop-Molotov or Hitler-Stalin Pact on 23rd of August 1939. This Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact was or had its secret protocol where Soviets, together with Germans, divided spheres of influence in Central Europe. From the Polish point of view, the most important was, of course, incorporation of half of Polish territories by the Soviets, and the other half was incorporated by the Germany. Soviet Union also incorporated part of Romania, and it incorporated 3 Baltic states. So Baltic states' position, formal position within the Soviet Union was a little bit different. Of course, from the internal Soviet point of view, it was not a special position because they were granted status of republics, of Soviet republics, as all other republics within the Soviet Union. But from the point of view of international law, it was different because they were in fact occupied by the Soviet Union. So they created governments in exile, etc., etc. Exactly as Poland did. Polish government moved from Poland and was arrested in Romania, but according to Polish constitution, the new government was created first in France, later on in London, and operated until the very end of the Second World War. It was recognized by the Western allies. So what is very, very important from the point of view of understanding of history of the Second World War in our region is that until the German attack on the Soviet Union, Soviets and Germans were allies. It is quite often when I give a guided tour to Western, especially British visitors in our museum, which is devoted to the Warsaw Uprising, which was organized in 1944, they are surprised to hear that German aircrafts were flying over Great Britain during the Battle of Britain on Soviet fuel. They remember only Stalin as ally. Yes, he was an ally, but after 1941, and we can understand that the Second World War was a conflict of 3 sides: the Western, the Western or world of Western democracies, German Nazi totalitarianism, and Soviet communist totalitarianism. As a result of the Second World War, Poland totally changed its territory. Soviet Union kept territories taken from Poland in 1939, but in return, Poland got some territories from Germany, the so-called northern and western territories of Poland, with the cities of Szczecin, Wrocław, or Olsztyn. You can see the comparison of map of pre-war Poland, marked with red line, and after-war Poland, this pink territory on the map. And we can see it in a broader perspective. We clearly see the Moldovan Socialist Republic, so the territories incorporated from Romania, the Subcarpathian Rus taken from Czechoslovakia, parts of Ukrainian and Belarusian republics taken from Poland, and Baltic states fully incorporated to Poland, and what is now a strategic Russian point, the Kaliningrad district, taken from the German state. We can also see in the north parts of Finland also incorporated to the Soviet Union. As a result of territorial changes in the years 1922-1954, Ukraine got some new territories. Soviet Ukraine got some new territories. We can see in the yellow those territories taken by the Soviet Union from Poland. In pink, we can see territories taken from Czechoslovakia. In brown, light brown, we can see territories taken from Romania. And in purple, we can see Crimea, which was granted in 1954 to Ukraine by Nikita Khrushchev. Since then, we had a Cold War between the Eastern and the Western blocs. You can see the territories subordinated to the Warsaw Pact or subordinated to the Soviet Union. Soviet Union used the formally international organizations like Comecon, it was economic organization, and Warsaw Pact, military organization, to subordinate states of Central Europe to its purposes. In light pink, we have two other communist states that split with Soviet Union in Yugoslavia in 1948, Albania a little bit later. In light blue, we see the Western countries that remained neutral. And there is a theory developed by Russian scholar, then popularized by Polish scholar Pawel Kowal, about 5 rings of empire, which it is about Soviet Union, but as Kowal claimed in an article written a few years ago, Putin was or is trying to re-establish those rings. So let me briefly tell you about the rings of Soviet Empire. First was the core of the Soviet Union. It means Soviet Russia. And this is, again, this debate whether the whole Soviet Union should be one Soviet Russia or it should be federal state. It was decided that it should be a federal state. So the second ring of the empire consisted of Soviet republics. Then we have third ring, which was constituted by the countries directly subordinated to the Soviet Union. It is Central Europe, but also some other states like Mongolia or Afghanistan. Then the fourth ring of empire are the other communist states. I mean here mostly Yugoslavia, but also Albania, etc., etc. And then the fifth ring of the empire are the communist parties in the Western countries. Communist parties in the Western countries during the Cold War, especially in some of those countries, were very strong, like in France or in Italy. They had about 25-30% of support of societies in those countries. So this model explains how the Soviet Union worked during the Cold War. And to some extent, if you read George Kennan's Long Telegram, one of the most famous documents of the Cold War, written from American embassy in Moscow in 1946, you can clearly see that he describes exactly this way of operation by the Soviet Union. Then we go just briefly to the Autumn of Nations, or the fall of communism in the Central Europe. There are multiple reasons of that. Soviet Union was weakening since the late 60s. The economic situation was deteriorating. The opposition started to appear, especially in Poland, in late 70s, in the beginning of 80s, with its peak with Solidarity movement in 1980. Communists had to agree for independent trade union, which in the year 1981 had about 10 million of members. Then Gorbachev came with perestroika. Earlier, Ronald Reagan in the United States, Ronald Reagan decided that the Cold War should not be kept, but it should be won by the West. Then Gorbachev came with his idea of reforms, and it appeared quite soon that the reforms rather dismantled system than repaired it. And we have the year 1989 in Central Europe, with some milestones in all of those countries. You have not a full list of those milestones, but some crucial moments in Central Europe you have on your screens. It started with roundtable talks in Poland. Then, as a result of those roundtable talks, we had partly free elections in Poland. Partly free means that 35% of places were voted in the free elections, and 65 were voted in not free elections, so only communists and two satellite parties were allowed to apply for those 65% of seats in the Polish parliament. Then we have official burial of Imre Nagy in Hungary, which was a mass demonstration against the communism, against Russian presence or Soviet presence in Hungarian territory. Then we have the fall of the Berlin Wall in Germany, fall of long-term communist dictator Todor Zhivkov in Bulgaria. On 17th of November, we have the beginning of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. And the last point here, of course, it did not finish the whole process. But the last, I would say, the last state that joined this Autumn of Nations was Romania, with a escape of Ceausescu from the parliament, and then he was captured and executed in Romania. The next step of the dissolution of Soviet Empire was the dissolution of the second ring. The Autumn of Nations, we can say that it was dissolution of the third ring of the empire, but then the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the dissolution of the second ring of the empire. Just few moments, of course, demonstrations in Tbilisi suppressed by Soviet army. Then the conflict of Nagorno-Karabakh, again with the Soviet army sent to Armenia and Azerbaijan. Then the First Republic, Lithuania, declares independence in March 1990, then suspends it. Soviet troops attack Vilnius with some victims in Lithuania. Then we have an attempt to restore the communist order in the Soviet Union with the Yanayev coup or the August coup, where I would say the star of Boris Yeltsin emerged because he operated strongly against these hardliners in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And then we have documents that finally dissolved the Soviet Union. Final document was signed on 26th of December 1991. As a result, I would say that a kind of vacuum of security, vacuum or gray zone of security emerged in the Central Europe. So, of course, we still had Warsaw Pact and Comecon after the Autumn of Nations, but before the Soviet Union was dissoluted, also the Warsaw Pact and Comecon were liquidated. So the Central European states decided that they would like to join the Euro-Atlantic structures. If we take a look into the Autumn of Nations in Central Europe, we can clearly see that the most popular catchword was that we should return to Europe. And return to Europe meant joining the Euro-Atlantic structures, to be a full part of Western civilization, as Huntington would say, or Western part of the world. The West in the very beginning was not that eager, and the West was rather convinced that Central European states are not ready, or maybe they would not be ready for a long time to become a member of Western or Euro-Atlantic structures. However, the diplomatic moves, as well as regional cooperation, which shown that Central European states are capable of cooperation, and that the Central Europe would not become a zone of instability. And it meant that most of Central European states, you have list on your screen, on your screens, most of them joined the European Union and the NATO. Here you can see the maps of the enlargement. The solution of those 5 rings of empire stopped brutally stopped in December 1994, when Chechnya tried to gain independence. Chechnya was a part of, or is a part of, the Russian Federation. So if Chechnya was successful, it would reach the core of the empire. It was not Soviet anymore, but Russia itself. So the first ring of empire. So Yeltsin did not allow to do that. We had 2 Chechen wars. Second Chechen war was, I would say, a success of Vladimir Putin, and put his popularity in Russia. Then we had another wars, invasion of Georgia, and the beginning of invasion against Ukraine in February 2014. So we can see that after the dissolution of the empire within Russia itself was stopped with 2 Chechen wars, then Putin started to rebuild the second ring of empire with war against Georgia and war against Ukraine. On the other hand, we have Ukraine, which was changing, maybe not very rapidly, but substantially. We had 3 revolutions in Ukraine. First, called Revolution on Granite in October 1990, which resulted in the end with the Ukrainian independence. By the way, Poland was the first state that recognized Ukrainian independence. Then we had December 2004, Orange Revolution against forgeries of presidential elections. And then February 2014, even though the events were much longer than they started in November 2013, Revolution of Dignity, also called Euromaidan, which was ignited by the decision of pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych not to sign documents that would lead Ukraine to European Union. Massive protests against that were started, and in the end, Yanukovych had to, after he sent military troops to suppress the protests, he was forced to move to Russia, and pro-Western governments were established in Ukraine, won the elections, and started to negotiate with the West. And of course, this first Russian invasion on Ukraine, was a direct result of Euromaidan. And now going to the war, the hot war itself, we can see that for Vladimir Putin, history is an excuse for invasion. We have a quotation from 2005. Above all, we have to admit that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the biggest geopolitical catastrophe of 20th century. He said it already in the year 2005, and starting with that moment in next speeches, he always used history as an excuse for his imperial ideas. And of course, those are not direct quotations, but what he said just 3 days before the full-scale invasion on Ukraine was that there is no Ukrainian nation, they are Russians, and they should be a part of Russia, in fact. And second thing is that the power in Ukraine was taken by Nazis, and therefore no war, but a special operation of denazification is needed. So again, history is the main reason, according to Putin, to invade Ukraine. And now, in the end, before we return to Huntington, just a short question. Who is, according to Putin, who is the good guy, who is the bad guy? We have 5 persons. So good guys are only those who got territorial gains and were Russian imperialists. And he says that Peter I the Great, Catherine the Great, and Stalin were such persons. On the other hand, he criticized very much to other Soviet leaders. Lenin, who decided that there was no one Soviet Russia, but Soviet Union, a federal state, which according to Putin was a huge mistake. So he accused Lenin for destroying Russian Empire and creating in an artificial way the republics that then demanded independence and became independent. So Lenin is definitely a bad guy. Another bad guy is Nikita Khrushchev, who loosened Stalin's power, and the Soviet Union became less centralized, I would say. And of course, he admitted Crimea to Ukraine. So let's return to Huntington. Was he really mistaken? For sure, we can see, if we take into consideration the quotation I read in the beginning, he was mistaken. There is Ukrainian-Russian war. But was he mistaken in the whole theory? In my opinion, no. The only problem with his theory is that there is no Slavic Orthodox civilization. And the borderline in Eastern Europe that he drew, yes, is incorrect. I would say I would change the names of the civilizations. I would say that the proper division line is located between Euro-Atlantic and Eurasiatic civilizations. So Russia is Eurasiatic civilization, and the West, what he calls Western civilization, is the Euro-Atlantic civilization. Ukraine, Russians believe that Ukraine is a part of this Euro-Asiatic civilization. Ukrainians themselves decided that they would like to fully join the Euro-Atlantic civilization. Therefore, Russians decided that Russia should not allow them. And that's why the war happened. But Russians, of course, as I told you or presented you the long time history, Ukraine was for a long time part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Thus, it was a part of European civilization, not the Euroasiatic civilization. So now this is the decisive point whether Ukraine will succeed in their desire to join the Euro-Atlantic civilization. Thank you very much for your attention, and of course, if any questions, I would be glad to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pawel, for that excellent presentation. And there are a couple of questions in the chat box. Would you like to take one by one or a couple of questions together?
Sorry, I didn't hear.
Thank you for that excellent presentation. And there are a couple of questions in the chat box. My voice is echoing in your room. Neha, can you just go and manage that? May I request the Dean to kindly comment before we speak out the questions or read out the questions? Yes.
Yes, of course.
Thank you very much, Professor Ukielski. This has been a very erudite speech that you made. We are now far better in our understanding about the history of Poland, history of Europe, and the debates that you have elicited across the board in this region. Thank you very much for your intervention. The graphics were also very exciting. Many of us who have no knowledge about them, the graphs, the photographs, and various others, these are really enlightening. And thank you very much for your intervention. Now, the floor is open for discussion. If the speaker agrees to, then may I turn to Professor Sheetal Sharma to please enlist the chat box questions.
Thank you, sir. And you were very right that the presentation was very vivid and illustrious. So, so many maps and regional configurations changing over a period of time. It was really a delight to hear and listen to your ideas and also see those slides, which were very enriching for us to know about history. And there are certain questions. I'll read out the first one for you. Russian pitch appears to be at civilizational levels. Given the setbacks that Russia is facing in Ukraine, will such civilizational grand designs of Russia be drastically affected in the coming years?
Sorry, I had problems with the słabo słyszę. So, sorry, we have some. Może ja pójdę do twojego, bo tam lepiej.
Shall I repeat?
So could you please repeat the question?
Yes, I will.
Yeah.
The question is that Russian pitch appears to be at civilizational levels. Given the setbacks that Russia is facing in Ukraine right now, will such civilizational grand designs of Russia be drastically affected in the coming years?
Well, certainly. So Russia decided to invade Ukraine, to expand, to move border of its civilization westwards, because Russia believes that Russia is an imperial state for centuries. So Putin believes that without Ukraine, Russia will not survive as an empire. That Russia needs Ukraine to be a global player on the level of the United States and of China. So Russian problems in Ukraine and caused by the military problems, also economic problems. Russia is very weak economy and was before, even before. in my opinion, might lead to the final destruction of Russian imperialism. So Russia, after the defeat in Ukraine, because even if Russia, of course, Ukrainian forces will not enter Moscow, but if Russia does not succeed militarily in Ukraine, it would mean that this imperial idea would would be liquidated to some extent, especially as the Western world imposed very strong sanctions, which will influence Russian economy, already weak economy, for decades. So, in my opinion, Russia is rather outgoing empire. Like empires always fell, Russia is, well, this empire was defeated after the Cold War, and now it's, I call it in a sports term, extra time. So Russia is trying to regain its position, but Russia is much weaker than the Soviet Union was, and the Soviet Union lost the game. So I'm rather, I don't believe that Russia could really regain its position.
Dr. Ukielski, the next question is, despite, it's in the chat box also visible to you, despite a series of concrete signals like cyber attacks on Estonia, Abkhazia, and South Ossetia incidents, and then Crimea annexation and the recent invasion of Ukraine, did the West misread Russian signals?
Well, I would say, as a poll, I would say that to some extent, at least to some extent, yes. The Poles, Estonians, Latvians, Romanians were very much aware that Russia is getting dangerous, and we were sending a lot of signals to the West. And of course, they were to some extent ignored, to some extent not. We can clearly see that the Americans, even if did not react always openly, they did support Ukrainians. So Ukrainian army today is not the same as it was in 2014 when Russia attacked for the first time. So it is much more modern, better equipped, and better trained army than it was. This is for sure. And of course, we always have to, I would say, divide different approaches of different states. So British and Americans were much more aware of real Russian intentions than Germany or France. And this division is still visible, even though, of course, we have unity of the Western world. The sanctions are imposed by all of them, but still we can clearly see the differences between German or French approach and, let's say, Central European and Anglo-Saxon approach. So there are differences as well.
Yes. And the next question is, it's again in the chat box, you can see it. Drone strikes in the current Ukrainian theater seems to have ushered in revolution in military affairs. Following the Armenian-Azerbaijan war recently, Russian naval vessel Moskva was sunk and many tanks destroyed. Do you think that nations now should think seriously about building big armies?
Well, I'm not a specialist on military, but I would say rather that the armies have to be balanced. So yes, the modern weaponry like drones, like missiles, etc., are very much important. But also, on the other hand, we have heavy tank battles on the territory of Ukraine. And of course, Ukrainian tactics against Russian tactics proves they are more flexible. They do not take up open heavy battles because they know their limitation quite well. Therefore, they know what are their strengths, the territory, the tactics, and they use it. But I would be cautious with sending tanks to the history only. Still, they are needed, but yes, it's right that the modern warfare is also very, very important, and drones prove that they can be quite important weapon of modern armies.
Thank you. And the next question is, Poland has generously accommodated millions of Ukrainian refugees. What is their status now, and what are the problems that Poland faces at this demographic change? And I would like to add to this question, which comes from the audience, that during the peak of Syrian refugee crisis, Poland has a kind of, or Central Eastern European countries had a kind of difference of opinion with the Western European countries. And is there a difference in the way Ukrainian refugees are treated or seen at this point of time as compared to the Syrian refugees earlier?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes, we about 3 million of Ukrainian refugees came to Poland, and they are visible. First thing is that Poland, to some extent, got used to Ukrainian language because many Ukrainians came to Poland much earlier to work, and there were never problems, big structural problems with the Ukrainian minority or Ukrainian workers in Poland. And of course, there is, at the moment, there is no problem with Ukrainian refugees. There is huge support for them. On the one hand, yes, because people got used to Ukrainians and remembered that there were no problems, so it is easier to accommodate them now. Second thing is, of course, that there is strong belief in Poland that they are fighting not only for Ukraine, but also for the whole Central Europe. So this feeling is very strong in Poland. And of course, in the long term, some problems can appear. Their status is that they are allowed to get work, even they got special status that allows them to open their own small companies. They are allowed to travel by train with no fees, etc., etc. And of course, they are allowed to move to other European Union states. But to be honest, most of them prefer to stay in Poland. Most of them because they plan to return, but also they feel quite good in Poland at the moment. So this is the first point. Second point is about this refugee crisis. Well, the situation from Polish point of view was different. First of all, of course, because Poland was not against taking refugees as such, but Poland was against forced relocation of them. And today we also do not demand that some Ukrainians would forcibly be sent to France, Germany, or any other state. So this was rather this question. And of course, well, those refugees from refugee crisis in 2015, 2016, well, they did not want to go to Poland. They preferred other states in European Union. And today, Ukrainians prefer to stay in Poland. And this is the difference, I would say.
Thank you, sir. And there's a very interesting comment which I want to read out from one of the participants. And it reads as a very absorbing lecture, which is very useful in understanding the dynamics of Central Europe and the ebb and flow of international relations therein. The historical events involving Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, and Poland for more than 1,000 years gives the context in which the present war in Ukraine is being prosecuted by nations on either side of the Christian divide, separating the Catholics and the Orthodox. Together with the wars fought by Russia in Chechnya and Georgia under Putin, the theory of the five rings of Russian security becomes very clear. The Russian-Ukrainian hatred for each other must have gone back a long way, typified by the alleged man made famine in eastern Ukraine between 1932-33, now officially recognized as Holocaust by the USSR leadership by 16 nations. And this is a request to you. I hope the good professor would share a recording of this talk, which will be ideal background material for anyone researching the Ukraine-Russia war. Thank you so much. And with this good comment, I think it's very clear and evident that your talk has generated too much of interest, and it was amazing experience listening to you, sir, on Russia, Ukraine, and the history related to the war. And now we would like to end this by giving you a formal vote of thanks, for which I would like to invite Arshi.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Good evening, sir. Good afternoon, sir. Good afternoon, sir. And firstly, I like to welcome and thank you for being here. And I would like to say first, a very big thanks to Ambassador Boronsky for gracing us with his presence and support. His association with SIS JNU has been long known even before he assumed his office as an ambassador. As in the beginning of this meeting, he said that this topic is a very hot topic in the contemporary times. And you rightly, aptly said with this statement, and Dr. Pawel actually continued with this statement and gave us a very interesting background, as well as a very comprehensive background. A person who has no knowledge or background about the war, even the Polish history also, the very step-by-step history of Poland and how it started from the past to present and even during the wars. And the international position of it is very informative for someone who has no clue, and in a very simplistic manner. Thank you so much, sir. And it was very interesting and very informative. And your lecture was actually something I would actually go back and read it again and watch it again in the video. And I would also like to thank Professor Kondapalli, Dean of SIS, for actually conducting this event, Dr. Sheetal Sharma for organizing it, Dr. Shakti and Dr. Shakti for conducting the entire technological aspect of it, and Dr. Sneha for the continued support for it. And I would like to thank everyone, the audiences and the people who are viewing it on live on YouTube, for connecting us with this lecture. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much once again. I would request Professor Shrikant to say final bye to everyone and bring the event to a formal end. Shrikant, sir.
Thank you very much, Professor Sharma. And I think we are very much enlightened today with the discussion that has happened this
Sir,
morning.
you are not audible. You have to unmute yourself.
Am I audible now? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Professor Sharma. And I think everyone would agree with me that this has been a very comprehensive presentation. And the School of International Studies, thank you very much, the speaker as well as the ambassador, for coming in at JNU and providing your valuable time and advice on the subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I request Professor Shakti to formally end the meeting now.